You know those things you absolutely need to feel? Well, on your game.
Definitely.
But most of us, I think good sleep and staying hydrated are right up there.
Absolutely essential, yeah.
But what if these two seemingly separate things are actually connected in a way you might not expect?
Ah, that's where it gets interesting.
Today, we're diving deep into a really fascinating study that suggests exactly that.
Yeah,
Skimping on sleep, it could leave you dehydrated.
that's right. And maybe regardless of how much water you think you're drinking.
Whoa.
This research looked specifically at the relationship between how long adults usually sleep and their hydration levels.
Okay.
And it did this by examining data from two really large, diverse surveys. There's the U.S. National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, people usually call it NHANES,
Right, I've heard of that one.
and the Chinese Kailuan study. And so it gives us this really interesting cross-cultural perspective.
Okay, comparing U.S. and Chinese adults on sleep and hydration. That sounds useful.
Exactly, on a really fundamental aspect of our health.
So our mission today is to unpack what this research tells us about that link, between our nightly rest and how hydrated our bodies actually are.
And there's a finding in here that might genuinely surprise you.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on us. What was the study actually trying to figure out?
Well, the core objective was pretty specific to assess the association between typical nighttime sleep duration and certain markers in urine, biomarkers that tell us how hydrated people are.
Urine markers. Like what?
Specifically, they measured urine-specific gravity, or USGRI for short, and urine osmolality, USM.
Okay. Ooze and uasm.
Yeah, both are basically good measures of how concentrated your urine is. Higher concentration generally means less hydrated.
Right. The body's trying to hold on to water.
Precisely. The NANE study, the U.S. one, used both markers, while the Kailuan study in China focused just on urine-specific gravity.
Okay, so they're measuring urine concentration. How did they then decide if someone was, officially inadequately hydrated?
Yeah.
Was there a cutoff?
Yes, they set specific thresholds. For urine-specific gravity, anything above 1.020 grams per milliliter.
Okay.
And for urine osmolality, it was a value greater than 831 milliosmoles per kilogram.
Right.
Levels above those cutoffs were taken to indicate inadequate hydration. Essentially, it suggests the kidneys are working harder to conserve water.
Makes sense. Okay, now the other side of the equation. Sleep.
Yeah.
How did they figure out how much sleep everyone was getting in both the U.S. and China?
It was all self-reported.
Ah, okay. So asking people.
Exactly. In both NNEs and Kailuan, participants reported their usual nighttime sleep duration.
And how do they group that?
They categorized it. Less than 6 hours, 6 hours exactly, 7 hours, 8 hours, and then 9 or more hours.
Standard categories, seems like.
Yeah, and importantly, they used 8 hours as the reference point, the comparison group.
Because that's often seen as the ideal, or at least the healthy amount.
Right, so they compared everyone else to the 8-hour sleepers.
Okay, let's get into the findings then. What did the data from the U.S., the NEANES study, actually show about this sleep hydration link?
Well, what's quite interesting here is that the NNA's data initially suggested a mild U-shaped relationship.
U-shaped, meaning?
Meaning that the highest urine concentration, so potentially the worst hydration, was seen in people sleeping very short amounts, but maybe also slightly higher in those sleeping very long amounts compared to the middle.
Huh. Okay, so maybe extremes at both ends.
That was the initial sort of hint, but then they dug a bit deeper. They looked at a healthier subgroup within the U.S. participants.
Healthier how?
They excluded people with diabetes and those using diuretic medications, as those conditions can affect hydration.
Ah, okay. Good to control.
And in that group, the results became clear. Adults reporting typically sleeping just 6 hours, they had significantly higher urine-specific gravity.
Significantly higher.
Yeah, and get this, their odds of being inadequately hydrated were 1.59 times higher compared to those sleeping 8 hours.
Wow, nearly 60% higher odds just from sleeping 6 hours instead of 8. That's quite a jump.
It is significant, yeah.
What about people sleeping 7 hours? Still less than 8, but a bit more than 6.
They also showed an increased risk, not quite as high as the 6-hour group, but still elevated. Those getting 7 hours had about 1.30 times higher odds of inadequate hydration compared to the 8-hour sleepers.
So still a 30% higher risk. Okay.
Yeah, and when they looked at the other marker, the urine osmolality, the trends were pretty similar.
Similar how?
The 6-hour sleepers tended to have higher UOSM and slightly increased odds of inadequate hydration there too. Although those UASM findings weren't always statistically significant in every single analysis they ran.
Okay, so the stronger signal in the U.S. data seems to be with the urine-specific gravity,
Hmm.
especially for the 6-hour sleepers.
That's a fair summary, yes.
Right. Now let's switch gears. What about the Chinese Kailuan study? Did they see that same U-shape or something different?
Interestingly, no, the Kailuan study presented a slightly different picture. Instead of a U-shape, they observed more of a negative linear relationship between sleep duration and urine-specific gravity.
Negative linear, meaning the less sleep, the higher the concentration. It's a straight line, kind of.
Essentially, yes. As the amount of sleep increased, the concentration of urine tended to decrease more consistently, more stepwise.
So a clearer pattern in that direction in the Chinese data.
It seems so. Adults who reported sleeping less than 6 hours, and also those getting between 6 and 6.5 hours, they both had significantly more concentrated urine.
And did that translate to higher odds of inadequate hydration too?
It did. The adjusted odds ratio for inadequate hydration was 1.45 for those sleeping under 6 hours,
Okay, 45% higher risk.
and 1.42 for those sleeping 6 to 6.5 hours.
Still very high, yeah?
And even the group sleeping 7 to 7.5 hours showed slightly elevated odds, around 1.25 times higher risk compared to the reference group, which in Kailuan was 8 to 8.5 hours.
Okay, so pretty consistent trend there. Less sleep below 8 hours meant higher risk. What about the long sleepers in China? 9 or more hours?
Yeah, the results for the long sleepers in the Kailuan data were a bit mixed. They didn't show that same clear negative association with hydration that was seen for the short sleepers. It wasn't as straightforward.
Okay. So putting it together, comparing the U.S. and Chinese findings, what are the main similarities and differences?
Well, the cross-cultural comparison is really valuable here. I think what really stands out is that the increased risk, those higher odds of inadequate hydration for people getting 6 and 7 hours of sleep compared to 8, that was pretty similar in both samples.
Okay, so that 6 to 7 hour range seems consistently linked to worse hydration in both cultures.
It does suggest a potentially widespread link there. The main difference seemed to be at the extremes of sleep duration.
The very short and very long sleepers.
Exactly. The Kailuan study showed perhaps a more gradual stepwise reduction in dehydration risk as sleep increased from the shortest durations upwards. The U.S. data had that initial hint of a U-shape.
Fascinating. Okay, this is where I really want to know why. What could possibly be going on in the body? What's the physiological mechanism linking sleep, especially short sleep, to hydration?
Right. The study dives into potential biological mechanisms, and a key player seems to be a hormone called vasopressin.
Vasopressin, I've heard of it. Isn't that involved in water balance?
Exactly. It's also known as antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. It basically tells your kidneys to conserve water.
Okay.
And we know that vasopressin levels normally follow a circadian rhythm. They typically increase during the later part of our sleep cycle.
Later part, why then?
Well, it's thought to help prevent us from getting dehydrated overnight, during that long period when we're not drinking anything. It helps retain water while we sleep.
Ah, okay. So the theory is, if you cut your sleep short, especially missing those later hours,
You might be disrupting that crucial late-night surge in vasopressin release.
and that messes with your body's ability to hold on to water properly.
That's the leading hypothesis. By cutting sleep short, particularly interrupting that later sleep stage, you might interfere with normal vasopressin signaling and consequently disrupt body water homeostasis, making you more prone to dehydration.
That makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah.
Did they mention anything about why long sleep might sometimes pop up as being linked to dehydration? That seems less intuitive.
They touched on it briefly. It's less clear, but potential reasons could involve changes in how vasopressin is regulated over very long sleep periods, maybe increased respiratory water loss just from breathing for longer, or simply the extended time without any fluid intake. But the link seems much stronger for short sleep.
Right, the short sleep connection seems more robust in this data. Now, with any study like this, there are always other factors, right? Things that could influence both sleep and hydration. Did they try to account for those? Confounding factors.
Oh, absolutely. That's crucial. Both research teams made efforts to control for various potential confounders.
Like what?
Well, in the N.A. Haney's data from the U.S., they adjusted their analyses for things like age, sex, BMI, body mass index, how physically active people were,
Okay, standard stuff.
also alcohol and caffeine intake, which can affect hydration. And importantly, in N.A. Haney's, they did adjust for total water intake. Plus, they accounted for diabetes status and diuretic use, like we mentioned.
And in the Chinese Kailuan study.
They also adjusted for age, sex, BMI, physical activity, and alcohol consumption. One key difference, though, was that the Kailan dataset didn't have information on water intake.
Ah, okay, so they couldn't control for how much water people were actually drinking in that group? That's a limitation to keep in mind.
It is, yes.
But even after adjusting for all those other factors they could control for, did the main findings about sleep and hydration still hold up?
Yes, they did, and that's a really important point. The researchers performed sensitivity analyses.
Meaning they tested the data in different ways.
Exactly. They used slightly different cutoff points for sleep duration categories. They used stricter definitions for what counts as inadequate hydration. And the core findings remain consistent.
Okay, that adds confidence.
It does. They also checked if accounting for self-reported sleep disorders changed things, and it didn't significantly alter the main results about sleep duration and hydration risk.
So it seems pretty robust within the data they had. But, okay, let's talk limitations. No study is perfect. What should we be cautious about here?
Definitely. It's crucial to remember these were cross-sectional studies.
Meaning a snapshot in time, right? Not following people over years.
Exactly. So they look at associations at one point in time. Because of that, we can't definitively say that short sleep causes dehydration.
Right, correlation doesn't equal causation.
Precisely. It's possible there are other unmeasured factors involved, or maybe even that being dehydrated could somehow influence sleep, although other evidence suggests mild dehydration doesn't typically impact sleep duration much.
Okay, what else?
Well, there's the reliance on self-reported sleep duration.
Which isn't always perfectly accurate, people misjudge.
It can be tricky, yeah. Also, the majority of participants in both studies actually reported sleeping between 6 and 8 hours.
So fewer people at the real extremes.
Yeah.
Like very short or very long sleep.
Right, which limits the statistical power to analyze those groups as thoroughly.
Okay.
Then there were some methodological differences between the two studies, like how urine-specific gravity was measured and that difference in water intake data we mentioned.
Got it.
And finally, they didn't actually measure vasopressin levels directly in the participants. So the role of vasopressin, while biologically plausible, remains a hypothesis based on these findings.
Okay, so we need to keep those caveats in mind. But despite the limitations, you mentioned strengths too. What were the big pluses of this research?
Absolutely. A major strength is using those objective urinary markers of hydration, 2 of them in the U.S. study.
Better than just asking people if they feel thirsty.
Much better, yes. Also, the sheer size of the samples and the fact that they are large, nationally representative samples from 2 different countries, the U.S. and China. That's significant.
Yeah, that cross-cultural aspect is powerful.
And the consistency of the main finding that link between 6 or 7 hours of sleep and higher dehydration risk across different analyses, across these 2 distinct populations, even after adjusting for many confounders. That really strengthens the conclusion.
Okay, so let's boil it all down. If you had to give the main takeaway message from this deep dive, what would it be?
The key takeaway is pretty clear. Consistently getting short sleep, particularly around 6 hours a night, is associated with significantly higher odds of being inadequately hydrated. This was seen in both U.S. and Chinese adults when compared to those getting a solid 8 hours.
And interestingly, getting really long sleep didn't show that same consistent negative link.
That's right. The evidence was much weaker or mixed for long sleep's association with dehydration in these studies.
So for you, the listener, tuning in to get informed quickly, but also thoroughly, this research adds, well, a really compelling new layer to why getting enough sleep matters.
Exactly.
It's not just about feeling rested or mentally sharp. It seems to have a direct line to something as basic and crucial as your body's hydration status.
Precisely. And this brings up a really interesting thought, maybe something provocative for you to consider.
Go on.
How might making sleep a real priority, not just an afterthought, contribute not only to feeling more energized, but also to supporting these fundamental bodily functions, like staying properly hydrated? Could optimizing sleep be a simple, maybe often overlooked way to help maintain your overall well-being, including your hydration?
That's a fantastic point. A different angle on self-care almost. And it makes you think about next steps, doesn't it?
For sure.
Like, could experimental studies where they actually manipulate sleep duration confirm this causal link more definitively?
That would be the gold standard, yes.
And what are the long-term health consequences if someone is chronically mildly dehydrated, partly because they're not getting enough sleep?
Great question. We know chronic dehydration isn't good, but linking it specifically to sleep patterns long-term needs more research.
And maybe are there practical tips or interventions that could help people tackle both sleep and hydration together?
Yeah, integrated approaches. Lots to explore there.
Definitely lots to think about. Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us today. Really fascinating connection.